This is Jenny Kunkel, and in this video we are going to take our logical model that we defined in Oracle Data Modeler, and we are going to engineer it into a relational model. In order to do that, we're going to click on the logical model, right click, and at this point we're going to engineer it to the relational model. We have the ability to set some details within our logical model that we want to engineer over. We also have all of the individual entities, etc., that we can select or deselect. We're just going to take everything that is the default and go ahead and engineer it to the relational model. And once we do that, in the relational model, it's essentially going to generate for us an entity relationship diagram. We can always go ahead and click on and expand the nodes so that we can read more clearly the information that is conveyed in the nodes, especially like here where we have quite a bit of information that's being cut off. We can expand that so that we can actually see that unique index that was generated. And again, here we're going to expand this so that we see all those foreign keys that were generated and expand it from a width perspective so that we can see that as well, all of the keys that are in that primary key. Now, one of the very first things that we want to do is we want to start with our student entity, and we would like to be able to generate our student ID value automatically. Instead of providing some number, let it use the identity. And this is going to be where we can go into our properties. And then if we go to our student ID field, hit the edit, go to the general node, it has the ability to specify an auto increment and the identity column. And we can go ahead and apply OK, and then say OK, and that's essentially going to save that. We can go through the same thing on our course, go to properties, go into our edit mode on the course ID on our general node, click on the auto increment and the identity column, apply OK, and then hit OK. Do the same thing on our teacher, go into properties. At this point, go into edit mode, go to the general tab, auto increment, identity column, say OK. And we have one other thing that we want to do with respect to our teacher email, and that is to change the unique constraint, because right now we have a unique constraint. It's currently named teacher_teacher email_UN. If we want to edit that name, we can come in here, click on the edit, and at this point change out this name, and in this case I just want to make it UX and go to the end and then get rid of the _UN. Once I do that, I can say OK, and then we can see that it's updated here and say OK again, and that changes it here within this node as well. Then we have our student course. We have a few things that we want to do here. We have these weird looking names that it generated for us. We have the student_student ID from that student relationship. We have the course_course ID, and then the teacher_teacher ID, and we want to clean that up. So if we go into the properties on this, go into our columns, and we're essentially just going to remove the student underscore from the student_student ID, go ahead and apply, then go to the course_course ID, remove the course underscore, we're going to apply that, go into the teacher_teacher ID, remove the teacher underscore, go ahead and apply that. And then the next thing that we want to do is actually go to the grade. Because for our grade, we did not use a domain to set up our grade. We went in and defined the type, and we do not have a check constraint on it. And probably we need to add a check constraint. We can do that by going into edit mode on our entity relationship for the column itself. And if we go to the default and check, this is going to give us the option to put in a list of values, and we can come in here and say A, add, B, add, C, add D, add F, and then say OK. We can apply that, OK, and then say OK. So now we have the check constraint. We have everything pretty much redefined that we would like in our entity relationship model. We had that renamed for our unique index. We've gone through and added our identity fields. We've refixed up the names here, added the check constraint for the grade. We have our model looking as we would like it from a documentation perspective, and typically we see the ER model in documentation more so than the logical model. But we can also take all the smarts that we've built into this model and generate our data definition language that's used to create our tables and our primary keys, our constraints, anything that we've added to this model will be generated, including the comment that we added on that student ID field. And we can do that by going to the File and go to our Export option and select DDL file. And this is going to give us a dialog that we can select what type of database we want it to be output to. In our case, we are running a 22C database. It has 21C. That's good enough for our purposes. We are running a much later version of SQL Server, essentially SQL Server 2022. It gives us an option of SQL Server 2012, but that's fine for our purposes. And then it also gives us an option if we had something that we wanted to generate a DB2 database table schema type statements for, we could do that as well. In our case, we're going to start with SQL Server, so we're going to pick SQL Server 2012. And we want to go ahead and generate this. This is going to give us a dialog that we can go through and select or unselect different things. We have the option to create selection, and we'll get into this dialog for sure in more detail when we get to our final project and look at it in more depth there. We have our drop selections, our name substitutions, include table scripts, and also include table DDL statements. We're just going to accept all of the defaults, so we are going to go ahead and say OK, and it's going to go ahead and generate our DDL for us. We can see that we have our table create statement for a course. Notice that the primary key is going to be generated as clustered, which is the default for primary keys for SQL Server. We have our table for our student. We also have our check constraint for our class level that we added in the domain. We also have the comment that we added for that student identifier for the student relation on the student ID column. That's going to be stored in the database. We have our constraint for the primary key that's being generated. Then we have our student course table definition, followed by that check constraint that we added within the entity relationship model on that student course grade field. We also have the primary key. We have our create table for our teacher shown here, and then we have the constraint primary key. We have our unique constraint. Notice that that is non-clustered, and then we are going to go ahead and have our foreign key constraints that are set up. And since we didn't change anything, there are going to be no action on the delete and update for those foreign key associations. So that's essentially our SQL Server. So let's go ahead and let's regenerate, this time for Oracle. File, Export, DDL. This time we're going to pick 21C. That's the closest to our database version. We're going to generate. Again, select all the defaults, say OK, and now we see that we have our DDL that is essentially generated for Oracle. And as we go through here, we have our table for the course, we have our student, we have the check constraint there, we have our comment on the column for student identifier. It looks a lot different as far as the generation of that. We have our primary key for our student, we have our create table, we have the student course check constraint there for the grade. We have our teacher. We also have the constraint for the primary key, the unique index key. Then we have our foreign key constraints as well. And notice here we have a sequence that was generated. Instead of actually using and defining an identity on those columns, it is instead going to define a sequence for each of those, and then it's going to use a trigger that before it inserts each row, that it's going to go ahead and grab the next value from that sequence and then assign it to the course ID. And we should see it do it for the student ID and the teacher ID. And that is going to be how it handles those sequences. So essentially everything that we would need to create our DDL and run that data definition language into the database to create all the tables, the primary keys, the foreign key constraints, our check key constraints. And in this case, because it is Oracle, the sequences and the triggers that would replace the identity in SQL Server. This is essentially our walkthrough for our modeling within Oracle Data Modeler.